It starts quietly. A phone that no longer rings. A room that feels too big for one voice. The smell of cold coffee left untouched on the counter from the night before. She used to have someone to call, someone who listened, someone who stayed. But now, even silence has an echo. Days blur into each other. Nights stretch endlessly. And somewhere between the last unanswered message and the weight of her own breathing, she realizes she's alone. Truly alone. That's the kind of solitude that strips you, not just of company, but of certainty. The mind starts reaching for familiar hands, but finds only air. The old sources of comfort, people, routines, distractions, dissolve like fog. And in that emptiness, something ancient stirs. Carl Jung called it the confrontation with the self, the moment the unconscious mind begins to speak louder than the world. It's not a breakdown. It's the psyche testing the strength of its foundation. At first, it feels like the end of everything. The job that defined you, gone. The relationship that gave you meaning, over. The future you imagined, erased. But beneath the grief, there's a strange quiet force building. Jungian psychology teaches that this collapse isn't destruction, it's initiation. When the external world fails, the inner one begins its work. The ego cries for rescue, but the soul whispers, "Now it's your turn." Most people never stay long enough in that silence to hear it. They rush to rebuild what's familiar, a new distraction, a new illusion, a new identity. But those who dare to remain, even trembling, begin to notice the shape of something else emerging, the inner fortress. The mind, stripped of external pillars, starts building its own strength from within. The unconscious mind begins to reassemble itself into awareness. And that's where the journey truly begins, not in comfort, but in collapse. Because the moment everything outside of you falls apart, the real architecture of your psyche starts to rise. This is the collapse of external support, the moment the mind is tested. There comes a moment in everyone's life when the world seems to pull the rug from under their feet, when external support, validation, or certainty simply disappears. It's the moment the unconscious mind whispers, "Now it's your turn." Jungian psychology calls this the initiation of the individuation process, when the self begins to separate from the crowd, from family expectations, from collective illusions. It's uncomfortable, like walking barefoot on stones, but it's also sacred. The human psyche, once dependent on approval, starts to awaken its own compass, guided by inner transformation rather than applause. Carl Jung often said that the greatest and most important problems in life are all fundamentally insoluble. What he meant was that life's real tests don't need fixing, they need facing. When everything collapses, the ego panics because it can't rely on the familiar persona anymore. You lose the job, the relationship, the dream, and the mind scrambles for identity. But that's precisely when the shadow work begins. The collapse isn't punishment, it's initiation. The psyche invites you to see the parts of yourself you've repressed. The wounded healer, the forgotten courage, the intuition long silenced. Imagine a woman who has built her entire sense of worth on a long marriage. One morning, her husband leaves, suddenly, and without explanation. The silence that follows is unbearable. She stops sleeping, loses weight, cries at the sight of her own reflection. The apartment becomes a museum of memories she can't bear to touch. Her mind spirals through guilt, anger, nostalgia, all archetypal emotions that mark the hero's journey into the unknown. But as weeks pass, she starts journaling to survive the noise in her head, and something shifts. Through words, she begins to meet herself again, not the wife, not the caretaker, but the soul underneath. The act of writing becomes her first form of inner alchemy. Soon, she's reading Carl Jung at midnight, devouring books on dream interpretation and depth psychology, listening to podcasts about healing the inner child. She enrolls in a class on emotional awareness and begins therapy, not to escape the pain, but to understand it. Slowly, the unconscious mind reveals its symbols, a recurring dream of walking through a dark tunnel toward a faint light. The shadow that once terrified her becomes her teacher. Her mornings, once filled with tears, now begin with meditation and reflection. Through study, solitude, and discipline, she starts building her own inner fortress. Months later, she gets a new job. It's not glamorous, but it's hers. She joins a hiking group, learns to enjoy silence, and even feels ready to love again, not from need, but from fullness. What began as loss has become liberation. That's the paradox Jung always hinted at. When you stop begging the world to hold you, you finally hold yourself. The collapse wasn't her end. It was her awakening, the moment she began to rely not on others, but on her own psyche. And that's where the real journey begins, learning to build the inner fortress. At some point, every seeker realizes that no one is coming to save them. And strangely, that realization feels like freedom. When external support fades, the psyche begins to construct something far more durable, inner resilience. Jungian psychology teaches that the unconscious mind doesn't just store trauma, it hides blueprints for growth. When you sit in silence, when you listen to your own breath instead of the crowd, those blueprints start to unfold. The fortress is built stone by stone, through awareness, solitude, and the courage to trust your own perception. Carl Jung once wrote that who looks outside, dreams, who looks inside, awakes. This awakening is not dramatic, it's gradual. It's in the way you handle rejection without collapsing, how you recover from loss without bitterness. The fortress isn't made of pride or denial, it's made of emotional alchemy, turning every disappointment into a deeper understanding of the human psyche. People who master this learn to live without the constant need for reassurance. Their consciousness becomes their compass. The storms outside may rage, but within, there's stillness. Consider the woman from before. As she rebuilds her life, she stops asking, "Why did this happen to me?" and starts asking, "What is this trying to teach me?" That shift changes everything. She learns to meditate not to escape, but to observe the voice of her shadow. She realizes her loneliness is not punishment, it's a classroom for self-awareness. She starts walking every morning, not because it fixes her sadness, but because it keeps her anchored in her body. Through these rituals, her inner world becomes her sanctuary, a fortress no betrayal can breach. Building that fortress isn't about becoming invincible. It's about becoming whole. The individuation process means integrating the forgotten fragments, the anger, the fear, the vulnerability. Each time you face your discomfort instead of running from it, you lay another stone in that inner wall. The archetypes at play, the warrior, the sage, the lover, begin to harmonize within you. The shadow integration techniques Jung spoke of are not abstract theory. They are the daily act of saying, "I see you, even in my weakness." That's real strength. And yet, the deeper this fortress grows, the more one realizes a subtle truth. It's not enough to build walls. You must also face what hides within them. Because somewhere inside that stronghold, the shadow still waits, not as an enemy, but as the final teacher. And that's where the next step of the journey begins, facing the shadow and becoming immune to emotional manipulation. The moment you face your shadow, you stop being easy to control. Most people are manipulated not by others, but by their own unacknowledged wounds. Jung called this psychological projection, the unconscious habit of seeing in others what we refuse to see in ourselves. When we repress anger, we are drawn to people who express it for us. When we deny our need for love, we chase approval like oxygen. The shadow isn't evil, it's an integrated power. By bringing it to light, you become less reactive, more aware, and that's where inner freedom begins. Jungian psychology teaches that the shadow is not a monster to slay, but a companion to understand. Think of it as the basement of the human psyche, full of memories, desires, and emotions you've labeled as unacceptable. When you finally turn on the light, you realize it's not demons you're seeing, it's you. A person who has met their own shadow becomes immune to emotional blackmail. You stop falling for manipulation because you've already met the manipulator inside yourself. You know its tactics, its fears, its whispers. Awareness disarms deceit faster than confrontation ever could. Let's return to our example, the woman who rebuilt her life. When she began dating again, she noticed something new. The old her would have ignored the red flags, silenced her intuition, and idealized the other person. But this time, she saw through the charm, the subtle control, the guilt games. She wasn't colder, she was clearer. Shadow work had given her X-ray vision. When someone tried to exploit her empathy, she no longer mistook pity for love. That's the alchemy of trauma, pain transformed into discernment. It's not cynicism, it's consciousness. Learning to face your shadow also means recognizing the ways you manipulate. Everyone does it, through guilt, silence, or self-pity. Owning these patterns is part of emotional awareness. When you stop pretending to be purely good, you start becoming real. That's the paradox of spiritual awakening. The more you accept your darkness, the brighter your light becomes. The unconscious mind stops ruling from the shadows when it's invited to the table. That's where emotional maturity begins, not in denial, but in integration. Facing the shadow doesn't make you untouchable overnight. It teaches you emotional discipline, a calm born from knowing your own chaos. You stop flinching when people project onto you, because you've already seen the mirror inside. The mind, once reactive, becomes still, aware, deliberate, unshakable. And that stillness leads directly to the next great lesson, the discipline of emotional detachment, finding power through stillness. Emotional detachment isn't about being cold, it's about being clear. Most people think stillness means suppression, but in truth, it means becoming the calm center of the storm. Jungian psychology teaches that emotional chaos isn't the enemy, identification is. When you stop fusing your identity with your feelings, you unlock what Jung called the transcendent function, the ability to stand between opposites, to witness light and darkness coexist within you. The unconscious mind stops shouting when it finally realizes you're listening. And that's when emotional stillness becomes power, not paralysis. Carl Jung compared inner balance to the alchemy of fire and water, opposing forces that only create gold when held together. That's what emotional detachment really is. Holding the flame without burning, holding the wave without drowning. It's a kind of inner transformation that happens quietly. Imagine being insulted, dismissed, or misunderstood, and instead of reacting, you feel the heat rise and choose to breathe. That moment is your laboratory of inner alchemy. It's where consciousness wins. Stillness, practiced consistently, refines perception until emotion becomes information rather than invasion. Modern psychology has finally begun to map what Jung intuited a century ago. In 2022, Ethan Kross from the University of Michigan conducted a study on what he calls self-distancing, the practice of speaking to oneself in the third person during stress. It sounds simple. Instead of saying, "I can't handle this," you say, "You can handle this." The result: the brain calms, perspective widens, and emotional reactivity drops significantly. Participants who practiced this internal dialogue accessed the same neural regions activated in meditation and mindful awareness. Jung would have called it a conversation with the self. Through this conscious distance, the ego stops drowning in its own emotions and begins to see them as passing clouds in the sky of consciousness. Our protagonist, the woman who once broke under loss, began unknowingly practicing this. Whenever anxiety struck, she'd pause and whisper, "You've survived worse. Breathe. You know this feeling, but you don't have to live inside it." Over time, that simple ritual rewired her emotional responses. It became her form of shadow integration technique, a modern echo of Jung's active imagination. She stopped reacting impulsively because she'd built a bridge between thought and awareness. Through this self-dialogue, she discovered that the unconscious mind isn't an enemy, it's a partner waiting to be heard. That realization became her unshakable peace. Emotional detachment, then, is not detachment from life. It's intimacy with truth. It's knowing that every feeling, no matter how intense, carries a message, not a mandate. Through self-distancing, meditation, and reflection, the psyche learns to rest in stillness while life unfolds in chaos. That's the kind of strength Jung meant when he said, "The pendulum of the mind oscillates between sense and nonsense, not between right and wrong." In stillness, sense returns, not as logic, but as wisdom. And it's from that wisdom that something even higher begins to form. Strength without bitterness, the sacred synthesis of all we've learned along the way. There comes a time when you no longer want to win, you just want peace. And that's when real strength begins to bloom. Jungian psychology calls this stage integration, and it means becoming whole again after life has split you into pieces. You're no longer ruled by anger or fear, but you also don't deny that they exist. You can look at both your light and your darkness and say, yes, both are me. This is what Jung meant when he spoke about the union of opposites. It's not perfection, it's maturity. It's when your pain no longer poisons you, it educates you. In simple terms, Jung believed that we all carry different faces inside. Some we show to the world, others we hide. The one we show, he called the persona. It's the mask we wear to fit in, to be liked, to feel safe. But behind it lives the shadow, the part that holds everything we repress, our fears, desires, insecurities, and hidden potential. When we refuse to see this part, we project it onto others, blaming or idealizing people for traits that actually belong to us. Integration happens when you stop fighting your shadow and start listening to it. That's how you become emotionally untouchable, not by ignoring your wounds, but by understanding them. You see, strength without bitterness is what happens when you stop letting your past write your story. When someone betrays you, it hurts, but if you keep replaying the scene, it becomes your prison. Jung said that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will rule your life and you will call it fate. In other words, if you don't face your inner patterns, they'll keep repeating as if the world were conspiring against you. But once you understand them, truly see them, the cycle breaks. You no longer react blindly. You respond with awareness. That's freedom, not from pain, but from being controlled by it. Let's go back to our protagonist, the woman who rebuilt her life from ashes. When she sees her ex-husband again, she realizes something profound. She no longer needs closure from him, because she's already found it within herself. She doesn't need an apology to feel at peace. Her forgiveness isn't approval, it's release. What used to make her bitter now makes her wise. And this wisdom isn't just psychological, it's spiritual. It's the birth of what Jung called the self, the deeper, wiser center of the psyche that connects us to something larger than our ego. Some call it intuition, others call it God, but Jung saw it as the voice of the soul. In the end, the higher integration is not about becoming flawless, it's about becoming real. You stop dividing yourself into good and bad parts and start seeing the meaning behind everything that happened. The individuation process, Jung's term for becoming your true self, is a lifelong journey. You don't arrive one day, you keep unfolding. You learn to live without bitterness because you understand that every heartbreak, every shadow, every silence was a step toward awareness. That's the quiet power of inner alchemy, turning pain into compassion and experience into light. And maybe that's what Jung really meant when he said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." Because once you get there, once you see that everything that broke you was actually building you, you become unshakable. Not because you've escaped the darkness, but because you've learned to walk through it with your eyes open. Carl Jung said that the greatest privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But few ever reach that point, because it demands the one thing most of us avoid: standing alone. The collapse of external support is not failure, it's initiation. It's how the unconscious mind invites you to meet your strength, to see who you are when there's no applause left. What Jung called the individuation process, the lifelong journey of integrating the conscious and unconscious, is the essence of psychological adulthood. It's when you stop splitting yourself between what the world expects and what your soul knows to be true. It's when the persona, the mask you wear to survive, begins to dissolve, and the shadow emerges, carrying everything you've rejected: fear, desire, envy, untapped power. Integration is not about eliminating these forces, but learning to dance with them. That's what inner alchemy means: transforming emotional lead into awareness, pain into purpose, reaction into reflection. Modern neuroscience is finally catching up to what Jung understood intuitively. Dr. Lisa Feldman Barrett, professor of psychology at Northeastern University and researcher at Harvard Medical School, has shown that the brain does not receive emotions like weather. It constructs them, moment by moment, through interpretation. In her words, your brain is a prediction machine. What you feel depends on how your mind gives meaning to what happens. In other words, perception shapes reality. This aligns perfectly with Jung's belief that transformation begins the moment you stop asking, "Why is this happening to me?" and start asking, "What is this showing me?" The psyche doesn't want control. It wants consciousness. So how do you live this truth in daily life? You start by noticing your patterns. The conversations that drain you, the emotions that rise on repeat. These are signals from the unconscious. Write them down. Reflect. When anger or fear shows up, don't suppress it. Translate it. Ask, what truth is this emotion trying to reveal? Because every emotion, when observed with awareness, loses its power to manipulate you and gains the power to teach you. Jung called this shadow integration, the moment you stop being possessed by the darkness and start illuminating it from within. In depth psychology, this is the turning point, when the wounded healer archetype awakens. You realize that what once broke you now equips you to help others heal. The cracks in your armor let empathy in. You no longer chase validation because you've learned something the world can't give: inner stability. You understand that solitude isn't loneliness, it's self-reliance. Emotional detachment no longer feels like distance, it feels like peace. And as consciousness expands, something miraculous happens. You begin to sense that life was never working against you, it was sculpting you. Every loss, every silence, every night spent questioning yourself was part of the psyche's larger design, to awaken awareness. Jung called this the self, the archetype of wholeness that lives beyond fear, beyond comparison, beyond despair. It's the part of you that's always been untouchable, waiting beneath the noise. So if you find yourself in that space, without backup, without certainty, remember this: you are not falling apart. You are being refined. The mind that learns to hold still in solitude becomes a fortress no storm can breach. That's what it means to be mentally untouchable. Not to escape pain, but to see through it, to understand that even in darkness, consciousness is still light. So ask yourself, what is life trying to awaken in you right now? What part of your shadow is asking to be seen? Sit with that question. Let it breathe. And if this message stirred something inside you, subscribe and stay with me. Because this path of self-awareness, healing, and depth psychology isn't about perfection. It's about awakening to your own power, one layer at a time. Because once you've met yourself in the silence, once you've built the fortress within, you'll never fear standing alone again.